1990 concludes, of course, the crazy decade of the 80s, the decade of turbulence, or as Motley Crue put it, the decade of decadence, where at least now people look at it as being a crazy and everything was too much and over the top and so on and so forth, which of course was true, but that really became apparent towards the end of the decade. And like I told you many times, it was in a way a natural response for the explosion of bands. And of course, it wasn't all bad. Today, people like to look back at it and say, oh, everything was out of hand and out of control and stupid and idiotic and so on and so forth. In the 80s, in reality, most people didn't really think of it that way. But let's take a look at 1990, who released what, when, why, and so on and so forth. So first of all, Painkiller, Judas Priest record from 1990 that bursts on the scene and explodes, and it shows the thrashers, the newcomers who came in the 80s, how to really do it, right? So it's possible to do something very heavy, very fast, very aggressive, and still squarely remain in the realm of heavy metal. So kudos for that. And of course, in the previous decade, in 80, they released British Steel, which was also very significant. And in a different way, in a different direction, it was going into where the 80s were going, so a very poppy kind of metal. But at that time, what they did, they showed the world that you can do commercial pop metal that is good and not necessarily super cheesy, although British Steel is pretty much in that realm. Who else? AC/DC, The Razor's Edge. Fantastic record. And again, they hit us in 1990 with something that's pretty similar, or at least in a similar way to 1980 with Back in Black, right? Back in Black and Razor's Edge. Black Sabbath released albums. Of course, in 1980, they came out with Heaven and Hell, which was phenomenal at the time. People loved it and it was great, a new direction for the band. It just occurred to me that Heaven and Hell was more than anything else, way more than a follow-up to Never Say Die, was really a follow-up to Long Live Rock and Roll by Rainbow, right? So Ronnie left in frustration, and he came to Sabbath, and he brought with him that sort of magic, right? So it's kind of like the follow-up to Long Live Rock and Roll with Iommi instead of Blackmore. Who else do we have? Gary Moore, Still Got the Blues. That's the one that really put Gary Moore on the map. Unfortunately, today he's not a household name, which he would squarely deserve. So he should definitely be on the level of recognition of B.B. King and Albert King and Howlin' Wolf and Eric Clapton and Stevie Ray Vaughan and Muddy Waters and so on and so forth. Unfortunately, he isn't, but he had a good run then in the 90s, right? So he came out with Still Got the Blues, and he ditched the crazy commercial sounding metal just in time, right? With After the War, even though the tour was phenomenal, but the album isn't liked so much. It's one true masterpiece out of it, actually two, with the bonus track. So of course Blood of Emeralds, and then the bonus track The Messiah Will Come Again, which is a Roy Buchanan composition. Phenomenal, kind of like another The Loner for Gary Moore. Who else? Black Sabbath, we said, right? So Tyre comes out in 1990 versus Heaven and Hell. I got carried away there with Heaven and Hell, but they hit the new decade with Tyre. Deep Purple had a record, Slaves and Masters, which is pretty universally or mostly hated by most Deep Purple fans. And of course, there was no Deep Purple in 1980. In fact, in 1980, even Rainbow didn't release anything, right? So Straight Between the Eyes came out in 82. Difficult to Cure was 81, and then Down to Earth was 79. So no 80, but, and I forgot to tell you this in the previous video, when I did 80 versus 70, Whitesnake released a big one in 1980, and that was of course Ready and Willing with Fool for Your Loving and Blind Man, and Ready and Willing, of course, the title song. So great stuff, and of course this is the same zip code as Deep Purple, same neighborhood. At the time, he had John Lord and Ian Paice, and of course himself from Deep Purple. Let's take a look at some newcomers, people who were not around in 1980, or people who maybe should have been around. Of course, Led Zeppelin was gone. The Stones, I don't remember if they had a record in 90. I think not. The big bands of the 60s, of the 70s, mostly were gone. Actually, I think I forgot to mention a couple bands that kind of came and went between 70. Not super significant, but they definitely deserve some recognition. So there was Atomic Rooster that did have an album in 70 and in 80, and then of course they were gone. Vincent Crane committed suicide sometime maybe in the 90s or late 80s, and then John Ducan, who was the vocalist, also committed suicide. Two suicides in the same band. Budgie came and went between 70 and 80. They actually released a little bit in the early 80s. Their last record, Horselips, great Irish band, also came and went between 70 and 80. Blue Cheer, who were pretty unknown. They are pretty much only known for an Otis Redding cover, Summertime Blues, and a lot of people claim that they are pretty significant, pretty influential. They really came onto the scene or into the more broader psyche of the public when a guy, sort of a small independent filmmaker, made a documentary about Rush, if I'm not mistaken, and there Geddy Lee spoke about Blue Cheer and how they influenced. I mean, you can actually hear that influence in the first couple Rush records, which I'm not a huge fan of. But okay, Rush themselves didn't have a record in 1990. They did have, of course, Permanent Wave, which is very, very significant for them in 1980, and a significant record in their catalog, even though I'm not such a huge fan of it. But in 1990 they had no record, and they did Roll the Bones in 91. So they had Presto, which I like a lot. And yeah, there was Presto in 89. Or is it Hold Your Fire? I don't know, I forgot. But they did have a record in 87, 89, and then 91, Roll the Bones. Listenable, okay, but to me doesn't rank that high in the Rush catalog, but I think it was well received by the public. So we spoke about newcomers. Who bursts on the scene in 1990, who wasn't around in 1980? We got Rust in Peace from Megadeth, right? We have Empire from Queensryche, all these people who just popped up in the 80s. We have Warrant, Cherry Pie. I think that came out in 1980. There was a band that's really worth checking out. We're kind of lost in the madness. The Casualties of the 80s. Let's just say Love Hate was a very good sort of Guns N' Roses kind, but with a little bit more guts, a little bit more substance than Guns N' Roses, and I think it was their first record that came out in 1990. I forget exactly the title of the record. Maybe Blood Red Bedroom or Blackout in the Bedroom, something like that, or The Back Room. Poison had a record in 1990. And of course, in the decade that came between, Metallica actually didn't have a record. That's kind of funny. But all of that thrash metal and the extreme metal also was kind of a reaction to all of the Hair, to all of the Wasps and the Motley Crues of the world, who both of them didn't release in 1990, right? There were a lot of bands that came and went in between. Twisted Sister, pretty notoriously. Twisted Sister had a big hit there with We're Not Gonna Take It, and the name of the record was Stay Hungry, if I'm not mistaken, which wasn't bad, by the way. They had big concerts, but they came and went pretty fast, as did many bands. Guns N' Roses, right, burst on the scene 1987, and that kind of also signifies the beginning of the attitude of the media, right? So until then, the media were all over these crazy heavy metal bands, especially in the first half of the decade. You know, whoever said the most F words and said the most outrageous things in the lyrics, they were all over them. Ooh, wow, smut on the level of a 5-year-old. And then towards the end of the 80s, they all of a sudden started to go, they started talking, they didn't call it grunge yet, they called it Seattle music, right? They called Queensryche a Seattle band, and Guns N' Roses, even though they weren't really from Seattle, but they associated them with that scene, which, at least in my mind, now that I'm thinking about it, I think that the whole grunge thing was analogous or pretty similar to the punks that came out in the late 70s against the so-called mainstream, right? So for example, you have a band that's called Rage for the Establishment, right? Tommy Moreno, who is, I don't know why, the big music magazines always put him as a top guitar player, which he totally isn't. But their claim to fame is that they pretended to be against the establishment. The real name of the band is Rage Against the Establishment or something like that. Rage for the Machine. Like probably they took it from Pink Floyd's Welcome to the Machine. And of course, all they do is cheer for the establishment. But it's a whole different point. This is supposed not to be political. What else came in the 80s? Well, of course, the big counter hair metal. So the extreme styles like thrash metal and death metal kind of exploded, right? First you had bands like Witchfinder General, and then the Dane guy, I forget his name, King Diamond, but I forget what his real name is. Which was okay. Merciful Fate is actually not a bad band. To me, the vocalist ruins the whole thing. So you had that, Witchfinder General, Merciful Fate, King Diamond, and then it went to all kind of other directions, more like Venom. A lot of people consider them to be one of the first thrash metal bands, even though they're really worthless. They're not musicians, but they did bring this style a little bit to the underground, right? So there was a pretty strong extreme metal underground there, mostly towards the late 80s. Slayer released their favorite record, which is not bad. It's worth a listen, I think, even for people who are not very much into thrash metal. So I'm kind of borderline on that. I'm not a huge thrash metal fan, but I can listen here and there. So I like Megadeth, Rust in Peace, right? Which came out in 1990 and introduced us to Marty Friedman and that kind of playing. Yngwie Malmsteen, actually, as much as I hate him, but he had a pretty good record in 1990, Total Eclipse, that was before Fire and Ice. Good record, started to go into the way too smooth and too virtuosic kind of thing. What he did before, I think, was more interesting. His couple first records, Marching Out, I don't like so much, but the first record was very good. Rising Flames, or Rising Force, something like that. And then he had Trilogy was a very good record, and Odyssey was Odyssey 88 and Eclipse 1990. So not a bad record, but getting a little bit too smooth already. So this was the nature of 1990 versus 1980, and a little bit of what went on in between. There were a lot of bands that came and went in between and didn't make it. And of course, the new decade was kind of ushered in by bands that sort of kind of went away from that in different ways, right? We had the Guns N' Roses and Skid Row and Love Hate sort of group, and then we had the extreme metal, all of the death metal and the black metal and the goth metal and the this metal and that metal, like the super undergroundy Sodom and what else did they have? What's the famous thrash metal band from Brazil, Sepultura and Obituary. Of course, I'm forgetting, all of the German European metal that kind of Europe was catching up with England and the United States. So they came out with Halloween, which I think also did release a record. So we had all of that kind of smooth speed metal, but not overtly commercial. What else did they have in that neighborhood? Maybe Ed Guy, Gamma Ray, which I think they're all kind of offshoots of Halloween. So interesting times, but the big ones, like I told you, were Still Got the Blues and the Razor's Edge and Painkiller, the Queensryche, the Newcomers, and I think Metallica missed it. Metallica missed the 1990 mark. I think that's the album was their big commercial break, and I always thought it was 1990, but it was early 1991. Ozzy also missed the decade, so his Blizzard of Oz was really initially released in 80, but with Mama I'm Coming Home, what's the name of the record? Very good record, very great sound, great playing there. No More Tears. Yeah, it just missed a decade. I think it was released in January 91. So there were a couple who were close but didn't quite make it, and they continued on. So actually kudos to Ozzy, because if I'm not mistaken, he's one of those who never gave in to these fads and never went after the grunge thrash metal, death metal kind of sound. Neither did Motorhead. Kudos to them. They also missed the decade. They also released 1916, which wasn't their greatest record, but it just missed 1990 by a little bit. So there we go. 90 versus 80 and a little bit of what was going on in between. And I think I will see you in the next one, 2000 versus 1990. And of course, as usual, check out the other videos. And in the meantime, keep rocking on and on and on and on.